Canada destroys US farmers with a 400% potash price hike, what if the ground beneath the farmers' feet turned on them not because of a drought, a flood, or a pestilence, but because of a quiet decision made in a boardroom hundreds of miles away in another country? What if one of the most vital resources for growing America's food, the very nutrients in the soil, was suddenly being used as an economic weapon? It sounds like the plot of a geopolitical thriller, but for thousands of American farmers, it's a fear that has become terrifyingly real. A shocking story is ripping through farming communities and blasting across social media, igniting a firestorm of panic and outrage. The claim is simple, brutal, and to the point. Canada has hit US farmers with a 400% price hike on potash. Now, if you've never heard of potash, you're not alone. But for a farmer, it's as essential as rain. It's a key nutrient, the K in the NPK fertilizer mix that plants need to grow strong, healthy, and resilient. Without it, crop yields collapse, stalks weaken, and a farmer's entire season can be lost. A 400% price increase isn't just an inconvenience. For a family farm already operating on razor-thin margins, it would be a death sentence delivered by spreadsheet. This explosive story has sent shockwaves of fear through the American heartland. Farmers who are already weathering the storms of unpredictable weather, volatile commodity prices, and rising fuel costs are now facing what feels like a declaration of economic warfare. We heard from farmers in the Midwest, their faces etched with a familiar worry, now amplified to a new level. One told us, his voice barely a whisper, "If this is true, we're done. There's just no way to survive that. We'd be wiped out before the combines even start rolling." You can hear that same raw fear in conversations at diners, in the aisles of co-ops, and on front porches across rural America. And it all boils down to one terrifying question. Is this a calculated act of economic aggression from our closest ally and trading partner, or is it a political lie, a piece of disinformation spinning dangerously out of control? The answer to that question affects not just the livelihoods of countless farming families, but the security and affordability of the entire American food supply. So we decided to cut through the noise, bypass the rhetoric, and find out what's really going on. To truly understand what a 400% price hike would mean, you have to walk in a farmer's boots for a minute. Let's picture a farmer, we'll call him John. He runs a mid-sized family farm in the Corn Belt, a legacy passed down through 4 generations. His entire life and the life of his family is a relentless cycle of calculated risks, immense debt, and back-breaking work, all in the hope of a good harvest. Every single year, long before the ground has thawed, John sits at his kitchen table, surrounded by spreadsheets and loan applications, planning for the next season. He has to forecast his input costs, diesel for the tractor, seeds for the field, and the big 3 of soil fertility, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That potassium, the all-important K, comes from potash. For John, it's not an optional expense. It's the invisible hand that helps his corn stalk stand tall against the wind, and it directly determines how many bushels of grain he'll have to sell at harvest. Let's say last year he budgeted for potash at around $350 a ton. It's a huge line item, one of his biggest expenses, but it's a predictable one. He builds his entire operating budget around it. He takes out massive loans from the bank based on it. Now imagine John waking up to a news alert on his phone or a frantic call from his neighbor. The message is the same, spreading like wildfire. The price of Canadian potash, the very foundation of his soil's fertility, just jumped 400%. That $350 a ton is suddenly $1,750. His fertilizer bill, a cornerstone of his annual budget, has just quintupled without warning. The shock would be immediate and sickening. This isn't just a number on a screen. It's a direct existential threat to his family's future and his great-grandfather's legacy. His mind would race through the devastating domino effect. First, the immediate financial crisis. No bank on earth is going to extend a loan that has ballooned to 5 times its original, already substantial size. He simply can't absorb that cost. The profit on a single bushel of corn is measured in cents, not dollars. A price shock this monumental doesn't just erase his profit margin, it blows a catastrophic, unfillable hole in his entire operation. His options become a series of impossible, heartbreaking choices. Does he buy the potash anyway, taking on a level of debt he knows he can never possibly repay? That's a one-way ticket to bankruptcy court. Option 2, the most likely and most painful scenario, is that he cuts way back on potash or skips it entirely for a year. This guarantees a smaller, weaker harvest. His yields would plummet, leaving him with less grain to sell to cover his other costs. It's a guaranteed loss. Option 3 is the one that keeps him up at night. He lets some of his fields go unplanted. The land his great-grandfather broke, the very fields where he taught his own kids to drive a tractor, would just sit empty, a silent monument to his defeat. This isn't just John's story, it's the story of thousands of American farmers who heard this claim and felt a cold, creeping dread spread through their chests. The fear isn't just about a bad year or a tight margin. It's about an extinction-level event for a way of life that forms the backbone of rural America. It's the terror of losing everything, not to a storm you can see coming, but to an invisible economic hurricane brewed in a distant capital. So, is this economic warfare, or is it a political lie? To find the truth, we followed the money, the market data, and the political games being played with America's food supply. The argument for economic warfare boils down to a single powerful word: leverage. And when it comes to potash, Canada holds all the cards. The numbers are staggering. The United States imports somewhere between 80 and 95% of all the potash it uses every year, for a resource that is absolutely non-negotiable for growing the crops that feed the nation. America is almost entirely dependent on other countries, and our number one supplier by a long shot is Canada. This isn't a new problem, it's a simple geological reality. The world's best, most accessible, and most sustainably mined potash deposits are located in a massive basin under the province of Saskatchewan. This dependency creates a massive, undeniable vulnerability in the American food supply chain. So, if a foreign power wanted to squeeze the American economy, this is precisely where they do it. By simply turning a dial on the price of potash, Canada could theoretically hold American agriculture hostage. Higher fertilizer costs for farmers would inevitably mean higher grocery bills for every single American. This idea gains traction when you look at the recent climate of trade tensions. While the US and Canada are historically close allies, the relationship has been strained by repeated threats of very severe tariffs on Canadian goods, including fertilizer. In fact, former President Trump explicitly talked about hitting Canadian fertilizer with huge levies. From this point of view, a massive price hike could be interpreted as a preemptive strike. One could argue that Canadian suppliers, tired of the constant threat of American tariffs, are pricing in a political risk premium for all sales to the US market. In this scenario, major Canadian producers like Nutrien and Mosaic could start prioritizing more stable, predictable buyers in places like Brazil or China. Global demand for potash remains strong, and if the US becomes too volatile or difficult to deal with, they can simply sell their product elsewhere. The fear in this case is that America started a trade war against its own geography and lost. Now, for the other side of the story, is it all just a big politically motivated lie? We checked the numbers, and what we found wasn't a 400% price hike. In fact, the available market data tells the exact opposite story. Fertilizer prices have indeed been on a wild ride, but not in the way the viral story claims. There was a massive global price spike back in 2022 when the conflict in Ukraine and sanctions on major producers like Russia and Belarus shocked the system, sending potash prices soaring. But that wasn't Canada's doing, it was a worldwide event. Since that peak, prices have fallen dramatically. As of early 2026, retail potash prices have been relatively stable, sitting in the $482 per ton range in late January. Market analysts are broadly forecasting that prices in 2026 will be fairly flat, with no massive surge on the horizon. So where did the terrifying 400% number come from? It appears to be a ghost, a phantom statistic born from political rhetoric and weaponized to stoke fear. The story seems to be rooted in the threat of American tariffs, not an act of Canadian price gouging. And this is the critical twist. The real price pressure on American farmers isn't coming from Ottawa, it's coming from Washington, D.C. If the US were to slap a massive tariff on Canadian potash, it would cause a massive price increase for the American farmer. Experts are crystal clear on this point. Canada holds the supply, so the full cost of any tariff would be passed directly down to US farmers who have no other viable place to buy from. On top of that, the world is swimming in potash. Global production hit a record 76.6 million metric tons in 2024. Canada, far from being a bad actor, has actually been a key force in stabilizing the global market. And even more supply is on the way. The mining giant BHP is building a massive new mine in Saskatchewan called Jansen, a project now estimated to cost $8.4 billion, which will add millions more tons of potash to the global supply when it begins production around mid-2027. You simply can't quadruple your prices when the market is flooded with product, and more is on the way. The claim of a 400% price hike isn't just a wild exaggeration, it's a flat-out contradiction of all available market data. It's a political lie that cleverly weaponizes a real fear, the deep vulnerability of US farmers, and twists it into a baseless conspiracy. Okay, so the headline is a lie. There was no 400% price hike. But don't click away, because dismissing this as just another piece of fake news is a huge mistake. The fear that this story tapped into is very real, and it reveals a much deeper problem. The real story isn't about a sudden act of economic warfare. It's about a slow burning crisis of dependency and the immense danger of playing political games with a fragile global supply chain. The true threat to the American farmer is the corrosive, paralyzing effect of trade uncertainty. For years, Canadian potash has flowed south under the USMCA trade agreement with zero tariffs, giving farmers the stability they need to plan and invest. The recent threats to tear up that stability by imposing arbitrary tariffs of 25% or even 100% are the real enemy here. That uncertainty is pure poison for the agricultural industry. Farmers can't make smart long-term decisions when they have no idea if a critical input will cost $450 or $900 a ton next year. That risk alone forces Canadian suppliers to hedge their bets and look for more predictable markets in Asia and South America. The United States is slowly, quietly losing its status as a privileged priority customer, not because of Canadian aggression, but as a direct result of our own political unpredictability. Even if the tariffs never actually happen, the damage is already being done in the form of eroded trust and increased risk. Should they actually be implemented, it would be a catastrophic own goal. Experts agree it would be a direct punishing tax on American farmers implemented by their own government. Our government seems to understand this at least partially. In the past, it has rolled out massive aid packages like the $11 or $12 billion funds from a few years back to help farmers hurt by trade wars, but that's just using taxpayer money to apply a bandage to a wound that our own policies help create. The long-term strategy is, of course, to bring production home. The US is treating potash as a critical mineral and is offering loans to help develop domestic mines. But a new mine takes years and billions of dollars to build. It can't solve a farmer's problem next spring. In the meantime, the US remains completely dependent on a supply chain being actively strained by political rhetoric. And that brings us to the biggest implication of all: food security. A nation that cannot control the essential inputs needed to feed its own people has a critical national security vulnerability. The viral scare over a 400% price hike, while false, served as an unplanned stress test, and it revealed just how fragile the confidence of our agricultural sector really is. The ultimate winners in this scenario aren't in Washington or Ottawa. The winners are America's global agricultural competitors in places like Brazil and Argentina. The real story is one of a self-inflicted wound. The question isn't whether Canada is destroying American farmers, but whether our own policies are creating the very crisis we claim to fear. The 400% price hike on Canadian potash was a myth, but the vulnerability it exposed is the most important truth of all. The American farmer's greatest threat isn't a hostile neighbor, but the unpredictable, volatile nature of our own trade policies. The stability of the North American fertilizer market, a system built over decades of cooperation, is being methodically chipped away by tariff threats and the erosion of trust. We learned that America's deep dependence on Canadian potash is a strategic liability, and using that vital relationship as a political bargaining chip is a dangerous game with frightening consequences. The real cost is paid in uncertainty, in risk, and ultimately in the declining competitiveness of the American farmer on the world stage. The story of potash is a powerful reminder that in our deeply interconnected world, national security begins in the soil. We believe that cutting through the political noise to find the real story is more important now than ever. If you agree, consider subscribing to our channel, and please share this video to help get the real story out there about the challenges facing American agriculture.